The Grand Galactic Council Chamber stretched wider than most planetary capitals, a massive dome of crystalline metal that housed representatives from 500 different species across the known galaxy. Director Sarah Chen stood alone in the center of the amphitheater, a single human figure surrounded by thousands of alien delegates who sat in tiered rows that spiraled upward toward the dome's apex. She wore the simple blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, no medals or decorations, just a small patch on her shoulder showing a blue planet against black space. The charges against humanity had been building for months, whispered in corridors and private chambers, but today they would be spoken aloud for all the galaxy to hear. Ambassador Velthar of the Venn Collective rose first, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the floor. Humanity has proven itself incompatible with galactic civilization, he announced, his voice resonating through translation devices worn by every delegate present. They are too unpredictable, too emotional, too willing to disregard established protocols that have maintained peace for 10,000 years. Chen listened without expression as the then ambassador listed humanity's supposed crimes. Expanding colonies too quickly, asking too many questions during council sessions, refusing to accept their designated position in the social hierarchy that every species was expected to respect. The Marathi delegate spoke next, her feathered crest fluttering with what Chen had learned to recognize as disdain. Human diplomacy is crude, she said, her musical voice carrying a sharp edge. They speak of friendship and partnership when they should speak of duty and proper order. They laugh during serious negotiations and bring emotions into matters that require pure logic. One by one, species that humanity had worked alongside for 3 generations stood to deliver testimony. The Zentauri cited economic inefficiency, complaining that humans took risks on ventures that proper analysis showed had low probability of success. The Kryn military caste, their armored bodies gleaming under the chamber lights, called humans dangerously individualistic. They encourage lower ranks to think for themselves, the Kryn general growled. They promote this concept of initiative that undermines proper chain of command. A soldier should obey, not question, not suggest alternatives. Chen noticed which species remained silent. The Lirani, whose musical culture had found its most enthusiastic audience among humans, said nothing. The Thelkor philosophers, who had spent countless hours in debate with human scholars, kept their peace. Even the Verdani farmers, whose world humanity had helped terraform and cultivate, offered no defense. Fear kept them quiet, Chen understood. Fear of being associated with the species the council had decided to exile. When 473 species had spoken, when the list of humanity's failures and flaws had been repeated so many times, the words began to blur together. The council speaker finally turned to Chen. Director Chen, you may now present humanity's defense. She walked to the central podium, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Chen had prepared a long speech, full of statistics and evidence and appeals to reason. But looking at the sea of alien faces before her, some curious, most indifferent, a few openly hostile, she knew that facts would change nothing. This decision had been made before the session even began. Honored delegates, she began, her voice steady and clear. Humanity has honored every treaty we signed. We have contributed to every joint project we were invited to join. We have asked only for the same respect that you grant to each other. She paused, meeting the eyes of delegates who had once called themselves friends. We were the ones who stayed behind to rebuild Gateway Station after the void storms, when other species evacuated. We shared our medical research freely, asking for no payment or exclusive rights. We sang with the Lirani, debated with the Thelkor, and worked in the fields alongside the Verdani. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke. We have been enthusiastic neighbors, perhaps too enthusiastic for your comfort. We asked questions when you preferred silence. We offered help when you expected us to wait for orders. We treated you as equals when you wanted us to know our place. Chen's hands gripped the podium, but her voice remained calm. If these things are crimes, then we are guilty. If being ourselves makes us incompatible with your vision of civilization, then perhaps we are incompatible. She stepped back from the podium. We have nothing more to say. The vote was called immediately. No deliberation, no debate. The council speaker's voice rang out across the chamber as the tally appeared on holographic displays throughout the dome. 473 votes for Exile, 26 abstentions, 0 votes in humanity's defense. Not even the Lirani, whose greatest symphonies had been composed in collaboration with human musicians. Not even the Thelkor, whose philosophical texts now included entire chapters of human thought. Not even the species whose colonies humanity had saved, whose sick humanity had healed, whose disputes humanity had mediated. The verdict was delivered in the formal language of galactic law. Humanity had 30 standard days to withdraw all colonies, stations, ships, and citizens from Council space. They were to return to their home system of Sol and remain there under permanent quarantine. Any human found outside Sol after the deadline would be treated as an unlawful combatant, subject to immediate detention or destruction. Shen listened to the sentence without visible reaction. When the speaker finished, she simply nodded once. "We understand," she said quietly. "Humanity will comply." Something in her tone made several delegates pause, a calmness that seemed wrong for someone whose entire species had just been exiled from galactic civilization. Ambassador Velthar felt a flicker of uncertainty, but dismissed it as shock. The human would rage later, or weep, or try to bargain. They always did, eventually. Chen walked toward the chamber exit, her footsteps echoing in the silent dome. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back. "Thank you for making this clear," she said. "We needed to know where we stand." Then she activated her communication device and sent a single message that would reach every human colony, station, and ship across the galaxy. The message contained only 3 words, repeated twice. "Come home, all of you. Come home." As the chamber doors closed behind her, the delegates began to congratulate themselves on removing the disruptive element from their carefully ordered civilization. They did not notice the quiet efficiency with which humanity had already begun to respond. They did not see the lights going dark in human quarters across 1,000 stations. They did not hear the engines starting on colony ships that had not moved in decades. They had made their decision, and humanity had accepted it with disturbing grace. The galaxy would continue, as it always had, peaceful and orderly and properly hierarchical. Or so they believed, in those final hours, before they began to understand what they had lost. The galaxy watched, with satisfaction, as humanity began its withdrawal from Council space, expecting protests or desperate appeals, or perhaps even acts of sabotage from a species known for its emotional responses. Instead, they witnessed something that made even the most cynical observers feel uneasy. Complete, efficient, silent compliance. On the agricultural world of Verdania, the human farming communities began packing within hours of receiving Director Chen's message. Marcus Wedd had lived on Verdania for 32 years, had married a human woman he met there, had raised 3 children in the small settlement near the northern continent's major river valley. He and his neighbors had worked alongside the native Verdani farmers, teaching them techniques from Earth and learning Verdanian methods in return, creating hybrid approaches that had made the planet one of the most productive agricultural worlds in the sector. Now, he stood in his empty house, furniture sold or given away, his family's belongings reduced to what could fit in standard cargo containers. His Verdani neighbor Krell stood at the door, his 4 arms hanging limply at his sides. "You cannot simply leave," Krell said, his translator struggling with the emotion in his voice. Who will maintain the irrigation systems, the fusion harvesters, the soil processors? Marcus had spent the last week trying to teach Krell everything he knew, 30 years of accumulated knowledge compressed into desperate training sessions that both of them knew were inadequate. I wrote down everything I could remember, Marcus said, handing Krell a data pad filled with instructions, diagrams, and troubleshooting guides. The manuals are all in the community hall's computer system. I updated them yesterday, with notes about the common problems and how to fix them. Krell took the datapad with trembling hands. But this is your home, Marcus said. Marcus looked around the empty house one last time. The council decided it wasn't, he said quietly. We're just respecting their decision. Across Verdania, similar scenes played out, as human families boarded the transport ships that would carry them back to Sol. The Verdani watched their neighbors leave with growing panic, as they realized how much they had depended on human knowledge and human labor without ever acknowledging it. At the Frontier Research Station Kepler-7, Dr. Yuki Tanaka supervised the careful packing of 3 years' worth of experimental data. The station had been a joint operation with 6 other species, studying exotic matter and dark energy phenomena that could revolutionize faster-than-light travel. Yuki had coordinated the experiments, calibrated the sensors, monitored the equipment through countless overnight shifts, while her alien colleagues slept or pursued other projects. She had never complained because the work fascinated her, and she had assumed her colleagues appreciated her efforts, even if they rarely said so. Now, her Centauri colleague, mathematician 7th degree, approached her workstation. You are taking all the calibration protocols, he observed. Of course, Yuki replied, carefully transferring data to isolated storage cores. They belong to Humanities Research Division, but we will need them to continue the work. Yuki paused and looked at the Centauri, whose logical mind seemed genuinely confused. Did you ever learn how to run the calibrations yourself? She asked. 7th degree silence was answer enough. The truth was that Yuki had made it look easy, had volunteered for the tedious and dangerous work so often that the other researchers had simply stopped learning how to do it themselves. I left training files in the shared database, Yuki said. Whether you choose to use them is your decision. On the massive trade hub of Nexus Point, human merchants closed their businesses with the same quiet efficiency. James Rodriguez had run a shipping brokerage on the station for 15 years, building a reputation for taking on difficult jobs that other brokers considered too risky or too complex. He had financed ventures that seemed impossible, had connected buyers and sellers across species boundaries, had somehow made profits while also making friends. Now his office stood empty, the walls bare, where holographic displays had shown shipping routes and commodity prices. Station Administrator Quicks arrived as James was preparing to board the final transport. Your departure will create economic disruptions, Quicks said, his multiple eye stalks focusing on James with what might have been concern. Businesses on this station depended on your brokerage for financing or connections. Then I guess they'll need to find new brokers. But none of the other brokers work the way you did, Quicks protested. You took risks, you invested in relationships, you sometimes prioritized long-term partnerships over immediate profit. It was inefficient, but somehow it made the whole station's economy grow. Maybe that should tell you something, James said. He walked toward the docking bay, then paused. You know what's funny? We thought we were building something here, something that mattered. We thought we were part of a community. Turns out we were just temporary labor that nobody wanted to admit they needed. Throughout Council space, similar departures occurred across thousands of locations. Human engineers left critical infrastructure projects half-finished, with detailed plans for completion that local workers now had to decipher on their own. Human teachers closed multicultural schools where children of different species had learned together, leaving behind curricula that suddenly seemed impossible to implement without the humans' patience and creativity. Human mediators withdrew from trade disputes and border negotiations, taking with them an intuitive understanding of how to bridge different cultural perspectives. Human rescue workers, who had always volunteered first for dangerous missions, packed their equipment and went home. Human artists, whose galleries had showcased works from dozens of species, closed their exhibitions. Human explorers, who had mapped more of the frontier regions than any other species, returned their survey ships to Sol. They all came home, and as they left, they took something the galaxy had never noticed: their constant, enthusiastic willingness to help without being asked, to fix things without demanding recognition, to build relationships instead of just transactions, to care about the success of others as much as their own success. The Council observers filed reports noting that the human departure was proceeding smoothly, ahead of schedule even, with no incidents of violence or property damage. The reports praised humanity's compliance and suggested that the exile had been the correct decision. After all, if humans could leave so easily, they clearly had never been that invested in galactic civilization anyway. What the reports failed to note was the growing unease among the species who had worked most closely with humans. The Verdani farmers who couldn't get their irrigation systems to work properly. The Kepler 7 researchers who couldn't reproduce the calibration procedures. The Nexus Point merchants who couldn't find anyone willing to finance risky ventures. The Lorani musicians who performed to empty halls. The frontier colonies who suddenly realized how much they had depended on human patrol volunteers. The medical centers that no longer received weekly updates from human researchers. These concerns were mentioned in the reports, but marked as minor, temporary adjustments that would resolve themselves once the galaxy adapted to humanity's absence. On the 29th day of the Exodus, the last human transport ship crossed out of Council space into the Sol system. Behind them, they left hundreds of worlds and thousands of stations functioning normally. Everything worked. Everything was in order. Everything was proper and hierarchical and efficient. And yet, to those who paid attention, something felt wrong. The galaxy continued, but it continued without the laughter in the corridors, without the volunteers working late into the night, without the species that had brought energy and enthusiasm to every endeavor they touched. The silence where humanity had been was not peaceful. It was empty. And in that emptiness, the first cracks were beginning to form. 6 months after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council held its regular quarterly session in the Grand Chamber on Concordia Prime. Ambassador Velthar opened the proceedings with a statement of satisfaction, noting that the removal of the disruptive human element had restored proper order to galactic civilization. The delegates applauded, their various forms of approval echoing through the vast space. No one mentioned the reports that had been quietly circulating among senior administrators, reports that used careful language to describe what they called minor adjustment challenges. The Outer Rim Patrol Commander stood to deliver his regular security briefing, his Kryn armor gleaming under the chamber lights. Pirate activity has increased by 41%, he reported, his voice carefully neutral. Response times have increased by 67%. Successful interdictions have decreased by 53%. The delegates stirred uncomfortably. What is the cause of this degradation? Demanded the Marathi representative. The commander hesitated before answering. We are experiencing personnel shortages. Many patrol routes were previously covered by human volunteer ships. We did not realize how many gaps they were filling until they were gone. Then recruit more patrol volunteers from other species, Velthar said dismissively. That is the obvious solution. We have issued recruitment calls to all member species, the commander replied. We have received 17 applications in 6 months. Before the exile, we received an average of 43 human applications per month. The chamber fell silent. Finally, a Zentari delegate spoke up. Why would humans volunteer so frequently for dangerous patrol duty. What compensation were they receiving? None, the commander admitted. They requested no payment beyond standard fuel and supply allowances. They said they wanted to help keep the frontier safe. The delegates absorbed this information with visible confusion. Species volunteered for prestigious positions, for political advantage, for economic benefit, not simply to help. On the medical station orbiting Zentaur Prime, Chief Medical Administrator 7th Degree faced a crisis that numbers alone could not solve. A plague had broken out on 3 Centauri colony worlds, a virulent infection that spread through the respiratory system and showed resistance to standard treatments. The administrator pulled up the medical database that had once been updated almost daily with new research and treatment protocols from human doctors. The last significant update was dated 6 months ago. The last entry before that was 5 days earlier. Before the Exile, human medical researchers had contributed an average of 12 updates per day, freely sharing their findings with the entire galaxy. 7th Degree began searching through the archived human research, looking for anything that might help with the current plague. What he found was a preliminary study from 8 months ago, where a human doctor named Sarah Okonkwo had identified a similar respiratory infection and developed a treatment protocol. The study was marked as incomplete, with notes indicating she planned to do further research. 7th Degree tried to contact Dr. Okonkwo, but found that all communication with Sol was blocked by council order. He tried to extrapolate from her incomplete research, but human medical studies had a peculiar quality. They included intuitive leaps and experimental approaches that pure logic struggled to reproduce. By the time Centauri researchers developed an effective treatment through conventional methods, 3,000 colonists had died. 7th Degree filed a report noting that human medical volunteers had prevented 17 similar outbreaks in the past decade, usually stopping them before they became widespread. The report was acknowledged and filed away. In the great symphony halls of Lyra, conductor-poet Mirash stood before an empty auditorium. The Lyrani experienced reality through music and harmony, their entire culture built around sonic art forms that most species found incomprehensible. Most species except humans, who had filled these halls for generation after generation, listening with what Mirash could only describe as genuine understanding. Humans couldn't perceive the full range of Lyrani composition. Their ears missed frequencies both high and low. But somehow they grasped the emotional content, the narrative structure, the philosophical meaning embedded in each performance. Mirash had composed her greatest work 3 months ago, a symphony about the interconnection of all conscious beings. 73 Lyrani had attended the premiere. Before the Exile, such a performance would have drawn thousands, with humans making up more than half the audience. The Lyrani Council of Arts filed a report noting a 47% decrease in cultural engagement and a corresponding increase in what they termed social melancholy. Young Lyrani were losing interest in traditional arts when there was no enthusiastic audience to appreciate their work. On the construction site of the new gateway station, being rebuilt after the void storms had destroyed the original, project manager Thix reviewed the timeline with growing despair. The project was 7 months behind schedule. The delays had nothing to do with technical problems or resource shortages. The issue was that none of the species working on the project approached the work the way humans had. Humans had turned brutal, dangerous construction work into something they called a challenge. They had competed with each other to complete sections faster, volunteered for double shifts without being asked, had somehow found satisfaction in the physical labor that other species considered beneath their dignity. Thix had watched human construction crews sing while they worked, had seen them race to finish difficult tasks, had heard them laugh and joke even during the most exhausting days. The non-human crews worked efficiently during their scheduled shifts, and then left. They followed safety protocols precisely and took all required breaks. They did exactly what was asked of them, nothing more. The work was getting done, but without the energy and enthusiasm that humans had brought to every project. Fix filed a report, noting that future construction timelines would need to be extended by an average of 60% to account for the absence of human labor practices. On Verdania, Farmer Krell stood in his fields and watched the irrigation system sputter and fail. He had the manuals that Marcus Webb had left behind, had studied the instructions carefully, but something was wrong with the pressure regulators, and he couldn't diagnose the problem. The Verdani had lived alongside humans for 3 generations, but had never bothered to truly learn the systems the humans maintained. Why would they, when Marcus and his neighbors were always there to fix any problem, always willing to work late into the night to ensure the crops got the water they needed? Now the northern continent faced a potential crop failure, and Krell finally understood what Marcus had meant about respecting the council's decision. The humans hadn't been angry when they left, they had been disappointed. Across the galaxy, similar realizations were occurring to individuals and communities who had worked closely with humans. The species who had shared research with human scientists and never realized how much of the actual experimental work humans had been doing, had relied on human brokers to take risks on new ventures. The teachers who had worked in multicultural schools and never noticed that humans volunteered for the difficult students, the extra tutoring sessions, the after-hours help. The artists who had found their most enthusiastic collaborators among human creators. The council received thousands of reports, documenting what they termed nominal performance decreases across every sector of galactic civilization. The reports were careful not to assign blame or suggest that the Exile had been a mistake. But the numbers told a story that political language couldn't hide. The galaxy was slowly degrading, not catastrophically, not obviously, but steadily and inevitably. Growth had stopped, innovation had stalled, cultural exchange was dying, and in every corner of civilized space, someone was asking the question that no one wanted to answer. How much of our civilization was built on human enthusiasm, human volunteerism, human willingness to help without being asked? The Venn Collective issued a statement dismissing these concerns as temporary adjustment periods that would resolve themselves through proper allocation of resources and rational planning. But in the private chambers where senior council members met, a different conversation was beginning. A conversation about what it meant that a single species, representing less than 2% of the galactic population, had somehow become essential to the functioning of their entire civilization. And what it meant that they had exiled that species without understanding what they were losing. 18 months after the exile, the Frontier Defense Line failed to detect a major void anomaly until it was already breaching normal space. The network of early warning stations that monitored the galaxy's edge for extragalactic threats had degraded to 60% effectiveness. Not because the equipment didn't work, but because no species maintained it with the obsessive attention to detail that humans had shown. Sensor technician Ralph noticed the anomaly 17 minutes after it began manifesting, which was 16 minutes too late. The anomaly ripped through the barrier between dimensions like a knife through fabric, spilling chaotic energy into 3 nearby star systems. Emergency evacuation orders went out immediately, but the coordination between different species response teams was slow and confused. Before the exile, human volunteers had formed the backbone of emergency response coordination, their ability to think quickly and adapt to changing situations, making them natural crisis managers. Now, each species followed their own protocols, argued about jurisdiction, and waited for orders from higher authorities while the anomaly grew. By the time the crisis passed, the anomaly eventually collapsing in on itself as such phenomena usually did, 3 million beings had been evacuated in panic. 18,000 had died in the chaos, and the economic damage totaled in the trillions. The investigation that followed revealed something that made council members deeply uncomfortable. In the past 5 years, human early warning technicians had detected and quietly dealt with 7 similar anomalies, stopping them before they breached into normal space. The humans had never asked for recognition or compensation for this work. They had simply filed technical reports in the database and continued their monitoring shifts. The lead investigator, a Marathi named Selesh, included this finding in her official report, but struggled to understand it. Why would they not report such significant accomplishments? She asked her Zentari colleague. Preventing a void breach is worthy of the highest honors. Perhaps they did not view it as an accomplishment, the Zentari replied. Perhaps they viewed it as simply doing their job. Selesh found this explanation unsatisfying, but could find no better one. On the Economic Council, analysts presented data that showed the galactic economy had completely stalled. There was no crash, no crisis, just an absence of growth that persisted month after month. Chief Economic Analyst Vorn traced the problem back to a single factor: risk tolerance. Before the Exile, humans had been the primary drivers of economic expansion, not because they were wealthier or more numerous, but because they were willing to invest in uncertain ventures. A human merchant would finance a new trade route that had only a 40% chance of success. A human manufacturer would invest in experimental production techniques. A human researcher would fund studies into obscure phenomena that might lead nowhere. Other species invested when the probability of success reached 70 or 80%, when risk had been minimized and profits were nearly certain. The humans had called this behavior taking a chance or following a hunch, phrases that made no sense to species that relied on pure calculation. But somehow those irrational human investments had created new markets, new technologies, new opportunities that the entire galaxy had benefited from. Without that engine of innovation and risk-taking, the economy simply stopped growing. Everything continued to function, but nothing new was being created. Vorn's report concluded with a question that economic models couldn't answer: how do you quantify the value of hope? The Great Translation Project, ambitious initiative to preserve and share knowledge across all galactic languages, officially shut down after running out of volunteers. The project had been 90% dependent on human translators, who somehow found the tedious work fascinating. Humans had donated thousands of hours without pay, translating ancient texts and modern research into hundreds of languages, building bridges between cultures that had barely communicated before. The project coordinator, a Thelkor philosopher named Wisdom Seeker III, sent a final message to all participants. We sought to connect all minds across the galaxy, the message read. We did not realize that the connections were already being made by a single species that found joy in the work itself. Cultural exchange programs collapsed across the galaxy, as species retreated into isolation. Before the Exile, humans had been everywhere. The most enthusiastic tourists, the most curious students, eager participants in festivals and celebrations. A human would travel across the galaxy to attend a Lirani concert, or study Thelkor philosophy, or learn Verdani farming techniques. They brought their own culture with them, but approached other cultures with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Without that cross-pollination of ideas and traditions, species began to close themselves off. Why host a cultural festival when the only beings who truly appreciated it were gone? The fragile bonds of understanding between species that humans had helped create began to fray. On the frontier, the Kryn military faced an unexpected crisis that their rigid hierarchy couldn't solve. A pirate fleet had been operating with unusual effectiveness, hitting targets that should have been well defended and evading patrols that should have caught them. General Krath analyzed the tactical reports and realized the problem. Adaptive tactics, changing their approach based on real-time intelligence and local conditions. The Kryn military doctrine didn't allow for such flexibility. Before the Exile, Human military advisors had introduced concepts like initiative and adaptive thinking and leadership at all levels. These ideas had been controversial among the Kryn, who believed in absolute obedience to the chain of command. But slowly, some Kryn officers had begun to see the value in allowing junior ranks to think for themselves in combat situations. Now, with the humans gone, the Kryn military had reverted to its traditional methods. Orders came from the top and flowed down through the ranks. Junior officers who encountered unexpected situations froze, waiting for instructions from their superiors. By the time those instructions arrived, the pirates had already escaped. General Krath filed a report recommending a return to some of the human training methods. The Kryn High Command rejected the recommendation, stating that such practices undermined proper military order. The pirate raids continued. In the council chambers, Ambassador Veltar presented a comprehensive analysis that he had spent 6 months preparing. The report documented performance decreases across every measurable aspect of galactic civilization. Infrastructure maintenance, down 37%. Medical research, down 62%. Cultural production, down 49%. Economic innovation, down 73%. Emergency response effectiveness, down 55%. Educational program participation, down 41%. Volunteer civic engagement, down 88%. The report carefully avoided using terms like crisis or failure, instead describing the situation as systemic efficiency reduction requiring strategic resource reallocation. Delegate present understood what the numbers meant. The galaxy was dying slowly, one small degradation at a time. The solution is clear, Velthar announced. We must incentivize other species to fill the roles that humans previously occupied. We must offer greater compensation, recognition, and advancement opportunities for those willing to volunteer for essential services. Several delegates objected that this would require massive increases in budgets. Others questioned whether compensation would actually solve the problem, when humans had required no compensation at all. A Lorani delegate stood and spoke in musical tones that the translators rendered as poetry. We are trying to purchase what was freely given. We are trying to command what was offered in joy. We are trying to calculate what came from the heart. The chamber fell silent. Finally, a younger delegate from a minor species that had rarely spoken in council sessions stood. Perhaps we should reconsider the exile, she said quietly. The reaction was immediate and intense. Veltar's crystalline form flashed with agitation. Absolutely not, he declared. Admitting such an error would undermine the Council's authority. It would suggest that we made a mistake, that we need humanity, that we are somehow lesser without them. Are we not lesser without them? The young delegate asked. These reports suggest exactly that. The reports show temporary adjustments, Veltar insisted. Given time and proper planning, other species will adapt to fill these roles. We do not need the disruptive, emotional, unpredictable humans who refuse to know their place. But even as he spoke, Velpar felt a growing unease. The galaxy had existed for millions of years before humanity joined it. It would surely continue after they left. But something fundamental had changed, something that reports and statistics couldn't quite capture. Humanity hadn't just filled roles. They had brought something to galactic civilization that no other species offered. Energy, enthusiasm, the willingness to care about things that didn't directly benefit them, the strange human habit of finding joy in helping others succeed. And in the absence of those qualities, civilization itself was slowly grinding to a halt. The council session ended with no resolution, no plan, no path forward, except to continue as they had been, and hope that adaptation would eventually occur. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, many of them couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. But pride and politics prevented them from saying so aloud. In the Sol system, humanity continued its work, unaware of and unconcerned with the galaxy's struggles. They had moved on, and the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that truly meant. 3 years after the exile, the Sol system's borders remained completely closed. Not a single human ship had crossed into Council space. No messages, no trade offers, no pleas for reconsideration. Just silence, absolute and unbroken. The galaxy, meanwhile, was coming apart at the seams. The Rim Wars had erupted between 3 species that humans had been quietly mediating between for decades. Without neutral human diplomats to facilitate communication, old grievances had exploded into open conflict. The Marathi fleet, once the pride of the Council, suffered catastrophic system failures across 17 ships. Human maintenance crews had been servicing those systems for so long that the Marathi had forgotten how to do it themselves. Refugee crises multiplied as infrastructure failed on poorly maintained worlds. The Council was paralyzed by bureaucracy and indecision, each species protecting its own interests while the greater civilization crumbled. Ambassador Velthar stood in his private chamber and reviewed reports that would never be made public. The truth was worse than anyone wanted to admit. Without humanity, galactic civilization had regressed by what analysts estimated to be 200 years of development. Not because of technological loss, but because of social and cultural decay. The enthusiasm was gone. The innovation was gone. The willingness to help without being asked was gone. And nothing the Council did could bring those things back. Finally, in a closed session of senior Council members, the decision was made. They would send an envoy to Sol. The message was carefully crafted to avoid sounding like an apology, while hinting at reconsidering current arrangements and exploring mutually beneficial partnerships. Velthar himself would lead the delegation, bringing with him offers of provisional status and limited partnership opportunities. It took 3 weeks to reach the Sol system, 3 weeks during which Velthar rehearsed his speech and convinced himself that humanity would be grateful for this chance at redemption. The delegation arrived at the edge of Sol's territory and was immediately surprised by what their sensors showed. In just 3 years, humanity had transformed their home system. New orbital stations circled Earth and Mars and the outer planets, construction on a scale that shouldn't have been possible with such limited resources. The asteroid belt had been extensively mined and developed. Strange energy signatures suggested technologies that the Council had never seen before. But most striking was what Earth itself showed. A thriving world, green and blue and beautiful, with orbital traffic that suggested a civilization that wasn't just surviving, but genuinely flourishing. Velthar felt his first tremor of doubt. A human patrol ship approached and escorted the delegation to Luna Station, a massive orbital platform above Earth's moon. Director Sarah Chen met them in a conference room with windows that looked out on Earth below. She looked older now. Her hair had gone gray, but her eyes held the same calm composure Velthar remembered from the Council chamber 3 years ago. Velthar began his prepared speech about mutually beneficial arrangements and pathways to reintegration. But Chen raised one hand to stop him. "We received your message," she said quietly. "We understand the galaxy is struggling. We know about the void anomaly deaths, the Rim Wars, the infrastructure failures. We know because we still monitor your broadcasts. We still care about you, even if you never cared about us." Velthar felt his carefully prepared words crumbling. This wasn't how the meeting was supposed to go. "Then you understand why we've come," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "We are prepared to offer humanity a chance to return to Council space under certain conditions." "No," Chen said simply. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Velthar's crystalline form flickered with confusion. "I don't think you understand," he said. We are offering you reintegration into galactic civilization. We are giving you an opportunity to— We understand perfectly, Chen interrupted. You're offering us the chance to come back and fix everything that's broken since we left. You're offering us the privilege of maintaining your infrastructure and volunteering for your dangerous missions and filling all the roles you didn't appreciate until we were gone. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at Earth. For 3 years, you've had exactly the galaxy you wanted, a galaxy without disruptive humans, without our emotions, without our inefficiency, without our refusal to know our place. How has that worked out for you? The delegation sat in uncomfortable silence. One of the other members, a Zentari named Logic Seeker Prime, spoke up. Our analysis suggests that certain human behavioral patterns contributed significantly to galactic stability in ways that were not initially apparent. We acknowledge that the exile may have been based on incomplete data. Chen turned back to face them. You exiled us because we wouldn't submit to your hierarchy, she said, her voice steady but intense. Because we asked questions when you wanted silence. Because we offered help when you expected us to wait for orders. Because we dared to believe we were your equals, instead of your subordinates. She walked back to the table and placed both hands on its surface. And when we left, when we took away our constant willingness to help, our enthusiasm, our stubborn refusal to accept that things can't be improved, you discovered something. What did we discover? Velthar asked, though he already knew the answer. That all the things you dismissed about us, all the qualities you found annoying or disruptive or inappropriate, our passion, our creativity, our emotional investment in the success of others, those were the things holding your civilization together. Chen pulled up a holographic display showing data from across Council space. We've been watching, she said. We've seen the reports you try to hide. We know about the economic stagnation, the cultural decay, the infrastructure failures. We know that volunteer participation is down 88%. Because no other species volunteers the way humans did. The delegation shifted uncomfortably as their own classified data appeared before them. We also know that you still don't understand why, Chen continued. You keep trying to solve the problem with incentives and compensation and strategic resource allocation. You're trying to purchase what we gave freely, trying to command what we offered in joy. Velthar finally found his voice. Then help us understand, he said. Tell us what we must do to convince humanity to return. Chen looked at him with something that might have been pity. You're still not listening, she said. We don't want to return to a civilization that exiled us for being ourselves. We don't want to spend our lives trying to fit into a hierarchy that sees us as lesser. We don't want to work beside species that vote for our exile and then expect us to save them when things go wrong. But without human participation, our civilization is failing, Logic Seeker Prime stated. That is not a threat or manipulation, merely an objective observation. I know, Chen said softly, and that's exactly why we can't come back. Because you need us, but you still don't respect us. You want our labor but not our equality. You want us to fix your problems, but you don't want us to have a voice in how things are run. She sat down across from the delegation. Humanity has moved on, she said. We're building our own future now, on our own terms. We're creating a civilization based on cooperation instead of hierarchy, on voluntary contribution instead of obligation, on diversity that includes being different in ways that others find uncomfortable. You speak of cooperation, Velthar said, grasping for any argument, but you are refusing to cooperate with the rest of the galaxy. No, Chen corrected. We're refusing to subordinate ourselves to a council that proved it doesn't value us. There's a difference. She leaned forward. If the council ever evolves to a point where species are truly equals, where differences are celebrated rather than suppressed, where contribution matters more than conformity, humanity will remember. We'll remember that we offered partnership, and you demanded submission. We'll remember that we volunteered our help, and you took it for granted. Until then, Velthar asked quietly. Until then, we wish you well, Chen said, and her tone suggested she meant it. We don't hate you. We're not punishing you. We're simply choosing to invest our energy where it's valued. You taught us that lesson when you exiled us. The meeting ended shortly after. The delegation was given a tour of Luna Station. Chen wanted them to see what humanity had built in just 3 years, and then escorted back to their ship. As they prepared to depart, Velthar looked back at Earth through the view screen. The planet seemed to glow with life and activity, a stark contrast to the slow decay happening across Council space. We made a mistake, he said aloud, the words tasting bitter. Yes, Logic Seeker Prime agreed, but acknowledging that mistake would require the Council to fundamentally reimagine its structure and philosophy. Such transformation is unlikely. The delegation returned to Concordia Prime with news that humanity would not return. The Council chamber erupted in chaos. Some species raged at human arrogance and ingratitude. Others demanded the Council admit its error and make genuine amends. A few quietly began their own negotiations with humanity, hoping for separate agreements. But Chen had been clear. Individual species could establish relations with humanity, but only on terms of equality and mutual respect. No hierarchy, no subordination, no second-class status. For species conditioned to think in terms of rank and proper place, this was a revolutionary and uncomfortable concept. In the months that followed, the galaxy continued its slow decline. Some systems adapted better than others. Some species learned to do the work humans had done, though with less efficiency and enthusiasm. But the fundamental problem remained. The energy was gone. The civilization that had lasted for millions of years continued to exist, but it existed without the spark that had made it grow. And every time another crisis arose, every time infrastructure failed, every time someone needed to work late with no recognition to solve a problem that affected others, the galaxy felt it. The absence of the species that would have already been there, already helping, already caring. In the Sol system, humanity continued to build and explore and create. They expanded to nearby star systems, developed new technologies, made alliances with a few species willing to meet them as equals. They sang their songs and told their stories and lived by their values. And sometimes, on quiet nights, they looked out at the distant stars where the Council maintained its careful hierarchy. They felt no anger, no desire for revenge, just a quiet satisfaction in knowing they had found their own path. Galaxy had made its choice. Humans had respected that choice. And now both had to live with the consequences. The humans had departed in silence. The galaxy would remember that silence for generations to come. Because silence, they had learned too late, can speak louder than any words.